Welcome to the Lorecast, where we look into the lore and the stories by which we live. I'm Dr. Craig Chalquist, and you can find us at chalquist.com/podcast and at a number of other online venues. Royalty. What does that have to do with us? In some nations around the world, monarchs still rule. In the United States, monarchs do not rule, and yet we remain fascinated by them. Meghan Markle and Prince Harry have moved to Montecito, California, where everybody is bending over backwards, or just bending over, to make sure that they're happy and comfortable and that they notice as many people as possible. We see it on TV. We had Game of Thrones, we've got House of the Dragon, The Crown, The Royals, Becoming Elizabeth. We've got Elon Musk calling himself a techno king, whatever that means. So what is it with authority? Even in Jungian psychology, kings and queens are described as archetypes. And our tarot cards, which are inherited from Italian originals, have a whole set of what are called court cards, and similar imagery is there. So I want to look at a couple of different reasons why we tend to treat aristocracy as archetypal, as something given, as some inborn natural quality that some of us have and some of us don't. And then I want to move beyond that into where is our innate nobility, and ask questions like that. So in terms of the thrill we get, part of it on a more shallow level, we're going to go from shallow to deep here, is that we love pageantry. We have routinized lives, a lot of us, work ourselves to death, especially here in the States, where work is king. And it's really a relief to be able to participate in something ritualistic for a change. Work doesn't really feel like a ritual, although it is one. It's not really consecrated or sanctified in any way. It's just something we have to do for money. So there's no real help there. But we can turn on the TV or go online and see lots of pageantry. So maybe a little bit of this fascination with the royals is just that we love pageantry. We like seeing processions and people wearing glittering costumes and all that. But as I said, that's at a fairly shallow level. Another motivation for this is it gives some of us a kind of vicarious pleasure to see that at least some people in the world get treated like royalty. So that might be a factor too. Boy, I wish that were me, in that carriage, on that ballroom dance floor, wearing that sword or that crown. So that's understandable. And then for the more traumatized among us, which is more and more people every day, it seems like, another dynamic here might be identification with the aggressor. And on a societal level, we've been held hostage by the powers that be. And what I mean by powers that be is the people who, whether they're in government, politics, religion, industry, or what have you, who own the things that we need to live. And in order to get those things, we have to do what they tell us to do, or revolt, right? So in a sense, we're all in a state of captivity now. You can't even drive your car without having it be approved by a whole hierarchy of different officials, most of whom don't even talk to each other, which is always fun. And so, to some extent, we all suffer from a kind of mild Stockholm syndrome. We want to feel powerful, we feel powerless, and so we try to take on some of the attributes of the people who are making us feel that way. And, kings and queens are the oldest scam in history. They go all the way back to Sargon I, who installed himself as the world's first real emperor. He exalted his princess daughter to be the religious head of Akkad, which was the name of his empire. And ever since Sargon, we've been in an age of empires, a long, long age of empires with potentates, chiefs, dictators, queens, kings, you name it. We call them presidents now. And the game goes on and on. It's the few controlling the many through scarcity and terror. So sometimes the dynamic plays out that way. We want to feel powerful too, understandably, so we like looking at people who at least seem powerful. So there's a motivation too. But underneath all of it, I think there's an even deeper layer happening here. And I could sum it up in 3 words: an absence of gods. Now, I'm not talking religion necessarily. I'm talking more psychology. So let me tell you what I mean by an absence of gods. When we are not in conscious relation to the sacred powers of the universe, however different cultures conceive them, then we look for substitutes. And aristocrats are happy to be those for us. They come in and they take on the attributes of the holy. They put crowns on their heads that look like auras that are more properly worn by gods. They talk like gods. They act like gods. They become our gods. And even in countries like the United States, where we simply worship aristocracy but don't have it officially installed, even here it happens. Hollywood, the pecking order in many big companies, things like that. We are far from the days of Ben Franklin playing chess with Queen of France, who at one point lost the game, and Franklin reached over and removed the king from the board. At which point the Queen said, "We don't so play here in France." And Franklin smiled and said, "We do in America." Not anymore. And I think the underlying reason is that we don't have a conscious relationship to something that's bigger than us. Something that gleams like the presence of royalty. Only it's not royalty. It's reality of a different order. So let's talk a little bit about what the gods are in that sense, a more psychological sense. Now, those of you who are familiar with C.G. Jung know that he would have said that the gods are archetypes. And I'm going to avoid a long, confusing technical discussion about what archetypes are. I'm going to simplify. And one way you can think of archetypes is that they're primal patterns. They're prototypes in a way. So a simple one is the spiral. You see it everywhere. Archetypes, in theory anyway, are universal. So you see that spiral of water going down your bathtub. You look up at the sky through a telescope and you see spiral galaxies. There are spirals all over the place. Whirlpools along the coast of some places. They're everywhere. And they're also inside us. And part of what Jung gave us is the ability to turn inward and say, you know, these archetypal principles or patterns, they're parts of the psyche too. They're parts of us. So we make a symbolic move by saying that that spiral galaxy out there is also spiraling inside me as a path of individuation, of wholeness, of becoming more conscious of who I am by getting to know those parts of me that have fallen into shadow and that I don't usually access during the day. Maybe my dreams bring them back to me. So interestingly enough, spiral galaxies, they tend to last longer, they tend to evolve longer than, say, elliptical galaxies or galaxies of other shapes, because as they rotate through space, or I should say through space-time, those arms scoop in all kinds of hydrogen gas for star formation, and they funnel it back to the arms that are coming after. So the whole thing self-organizes in a really enduring way. So what happens on a galactic scale can also happen inside us, if we allow it to, by changing, by growing, by getting to know ourselves, by scooping in what nourishes the stars within us, so to speak. When we don't do that, than we see the stars in our TVs or online or through streaming or through the movies. The stars are no longer in us, and we seldom go outside and look at the stars in the sky anymore. And so they're in Hollywood now, or places like Hollywood. Kings and queens and other kinds of aristocrats are not archetypal, contrary to what all the Jungians like to say, or most of them anyway, because you can't see them in the natural world. You see leaders, they're out there, even in the plant kingdom. You don't see kings and queens, but you do see them in European civilization, right? So they're not archetypal in the sense of roles. They're more archetypal in the sense of substituting for divine powers that all our ancestors were in touch with at some point or another. So I mentioned the stars, that's an example. All the world's cultures have their own pantheons of figures that we call mythic in the West, or mythological, and that other people simply call sacred or traditional stories. So to take one for example, in China, if you grow up there, you hear about Nuwa. She is a creator goddess, a wisdom goddess. She protects us from the sky turning black and falling down on us, which makes me think we could really use her help right now. She's known for a lot of things. In many depictions, ancient depictions, she is somewhat like a human female from the waist up, and then more snake-like from the waist down. And there's lots of snake goddesses through the world in many different cultures, and they're often associated with some kind of wisdom. So one way of thinking about this is that when we're in touch with wisdom as a divine power, or just a power that inhabits the cosmos, then we tend to be in a conscious relationship with it instead of putting it on a human being. Likewise, if we're in touch with that aspect of existence that's full of drama and revelry and all kinds of abandon, maybe even mania, in the ecstatic sense, then we're in touch with powers that have been called after Dionysus or Osiris or the Gnostic version of Jesus, Attis, Adonis. Probably every pantheon out there has some version of the god of ecstasy. And that god represents the quality of existence that's ecstatic, that's dramatic. When we aren't in touch with that and able to transcend ourselves in our daily existence, then we do the Dionysian route a different way, and we get addicted, or we drink too much, or we do reckless things. And all of that is more a symptom than a conscious relationship to our capacity for melting down the ordinary limitations and finding some kind of exuberance and joy. In my culture, we have no direct relationship to the love and eros goddesses, the erotic goddesses, Aphrodite, Oshun, to some extent Lakshmi. The Irish called her by a number of names, one of which was Queen Maeve. In these stories, these are active powers. These are characters we can actually visualize. But instead we have pornography, or we have perfumes or costumes named things like Venus or Eros. Logos, which can mean many things, reason, harmony, even meaning, used to be considered a transhuman power. It was a dimension of existence. Now, when we don't make room for that, we get possessed by it, and we are all in the head, or we're all about reason and rationality, and we ignore everything that, say, somebody like Osiris or Dionysus represent. And likewise, when we have no direct relationship to what Hera stands for or her counterparts in other cultures, then we go looking for her somewhere else. So a way of summarizing this is that the beings, and again, we're considering this psychologically, not religiously or metaphysically, but the beings who show up as gods represent qualities of existence for us to be in touch with, qualities that surpass us, but that we can participate in directly in a kind of celestial pageantry or an earthly pageantry. They're powers that wander the world as well as the cosmos. If we look around with an eye sensitive to symbolism, we see tricksters and warriors and heroes and higher authority of different kinds, and maternal figures and transitional figures, all kinds of archetypal stuff. And it's archetypal because it's inclusive of the human, but it's beyond the human. Shows up at every level of existence. So now perhaps we have a little bit of insight into a particular circle that happens between us and people self-identified and identified by others as royalty. When you are considered an aristocrat of a certain type, then basically you're being encouraged to identify with your role and your office and your position in a hierarchy, none of which are human, particularly when the attributes that are used to describe you in that role are religious attributes, or at any rate greater than human, greater than normal. All of this lends itself to inflation, and Jung wrote about how we get inflated by these archetypes. If you think about, for instance, the king who's only a king, he can never be a human being to the rest of his family. Or if you think about a Frankensteinian creator seized by the spirit of Prometheus, and then he makes monsters. Or the guru who considers himself a redeemer of humanity and then gets into scandal after scandal. These are all close-up examples of archetypal inflation. And when we get possessed by archetypes, in a sense we become greater than human, although we lose our humanity into the bargain. There's a scene from Arthur Miller's play After the Fall where he's talking to the character of Maggie, who's a famous beauty actor. And if you know the backstory of this, you know that he's really talking about Marilyn Monroe during the period he was married to her. And she's going on about how everybody loves me and the producers love me and the marketers love me and all this. And he says, honey, if they could sell sausages instead of you and make more money, they would. So he's trying to kick her out of that inflation, and then she just becomes enraged. So when we're possessed like that by something archetypal, if it's mild, we can actually inspire other people. There's been times when I've presented on a topic I'm passionate about, and I feel like something else is moving through me. And that's a very common experience. Many speakers have it, many writers, many artists, other people. It's an experience of transcendence, as Rollo May would put it. And so those can be beneficial. It's when we get stuck to the role that it begins to be problematic. Nevertheless, the person possessed by an archetype is numinous, in other words, has a high psychological charge for people who are looking for a god to worship. And they find each other. I think of the example of Donald Trump, who comes pretty close to being the Christian version of the devil. If you compare the way he acts with the stories of Satan. And Satan, mythologically, we could think of as a trickster figure, just as Trump is. And, there are benevolent trickster figures all around. Comics and other performing artists, or your uncle who tells all the great jokes, or whatever it is. So there's nothing particularly demonic about being a trickster. But if you're possessed by the archetype and you fall in love with power and fame, you become quite dangerous. And so millions of people in this country look up to Trump for a variety of reasons, but one of them is they need a place to put their devil. He's right out in front of them, only they get confused and they think he's actually their savior. Which, now that I think about it, is something that Jesus himself warned about. So on the one hand, you've got royalty who identify with their titles and their offices and their appearances and the perks that go with being royalty and all the rest of it, all of which pushes them into a position of archetypal possession. This gives them a certain attractive glow to people who are looking for gods. And I did a whole podcast, by the way, on why we idealize people even though we're supposed to be adults. You might want to listen to that because some of those dynamics come into play too. So one might raise the objection that, well, okay, there have been plenty of societies, past and present, where the majority of people had some active relationship to the gods or the spirits or whatever presences they identified them as. And yet they're still ruled over by kings and queens. Well, so what gives? So there seems to be three big alternatives for how we relate to the gods, or the archetypes if you prefer that name. The big powers of existence, the big existential potentials that we're all supposed to be living in our own lives. We can either be in a state of subservience to them, in which case that's when we usually actually go find them to rule over us, right? So you're worshiping a pantheon of gods and then you install them in your government. That's one thing. Then the other side of it, a second side of it, is being in a more or less atheistic state of all the gods don't really exist, right? So what that results in is more what we've been talking about, where we go and find the gods somewhere else through projection and idealization. So then public figures become your gods, or science becomes your god, or whatever it is. Jung said, where we are absolute, that's where you see our religion. So it can work that way. In secularized countries, that's the most frequent way of doing it. Here's the third alternative, which is to recognize that these big existential themes, patterns, powers are outside of us as well as inside of us, and we have to have a conscious adult relationship to them in order to be happy and fulfilled and individuated. When that happens, we tend to lose interest in royalty. They don't have any charge for us anymore. They just seem revealed as ordinary human beings just like you and me, who are playing the oldest scam in existence by accepting all those projections and even believing in them themselves. I don't know how many times people have told me, I just meant such and such celebrity, or this person who's royalty, or whatever. And I go, yeah, and equally important, they just met you. So one way we can get our sense of proportion back is by considering the place of Earth in the cosmos. And I recommend hearing or reading Carl Sagan's famous pale blue dot soliloquy. And I hear it not as emphasizing our insignificance in the cosmos, but instead giving us some perspective on our struggles, and it makes you really think about why so many of us spend time idealizing people who are fighting to be the biggest ant on a very small anthill, or at least the most attention-grabbing one. Every teacher of morals, says Sagan, every corrupt politician, every superstar, supreme leader, saint and sinner in the history of our species lived here on a mote of dust, suspended in a sunbeam. The earth is a very small stage in a vast cosmic arena. Think of the rivers of blood spilled by all those generals and emperors, so that in glory and in triumph they could become the momentary masters of a fraction of a dot. So perhaps we can add to Sagan's fine thoughts about the pale blue dot the question of, given this reality, why do we spend so much time worshiping people who are actually just like us? So, against ideas of archetypal or otherwise inherited aristocracy, I would place the ideal of an internal nobility. And I don't mean nobility in terms of better than other people. Whenever you have a group of people that thinks it's better than somebody else, history always goes the wrong way, right? But no, I'm thinking instead of nobility of soul, how can I be a noble soul? And one way is to find these qualities of royalty in yourself, which is not a state of inflation, but a state of discovery. Where is my light? Where do I wear the crown in my life? Where do I assume the kinds of attributes that people appreciate? Where am I queenly or kingly in my actions in the world every day? And also, what's my relationship to these huge powers of the cosmos that live both outside and inside of me? All the things that the gods represent, where are they in me? What messages do they have for me? Which ones of those are up for me and asking for some kind of a, not just acknowledgement, but development? I've noticed that at various points of my life, these archetypes come up and they always seem to bring a lesson of some kind with them. And I've found that instead of projecting that onto people who are just as human as I am, it's better to become reflective. So when a lot of Aphrodite has shown up in my life in the past, instead of worshiping pinup girls, I ask myself, how can I develop an appreciation of beauty and love? What sorts of aesthetic appreciations are lacking in my life that need to be there? Because what good is life without the love and beauty goddess, really? It's flat, stale, and unprofitable. Or if somebody like Zeus shows up, where's my authority? Where's my oversight of the things I need to be concerned with? So by making this symbolic move, we can withdraw the projections from our fellow human beings and start looking at them as transmutable potentials that we can start actualizing in our lives right now. And I think it's important to be able to hold those qualities as symbolic rather than literal scepters and crowns and literal power and literal faces on TVs and magazines at the grocery store. It's interesting to me that in Greek, the word symbol means to bring together, but its opposite, the word diabolic, means to tear apart. And when we're too literal when we shouldn't be, then we start flirting with more diabolic possibilities that shouldn't be actualized, let alone projected onto other people. When we take up our own scepters of authority and take charge of our own lives, there's a mysterious passage that we go through where on the other side of it are fellow human beings every bit as fallible as we are, but suddenly their internal nobility is revealed to us. And then we can appreciate how their queenship and kingship might show up in the world. And wouldn't that be a foundation psychologically of real democracy, where nobody's better than anybody? Everybody's recognized as of infinite, inherent worth. Doesn't matter who your father was or your mother. Doesn't matter what side of town you came from or where you got your degree, if you even got one at all. None of that becomes as important as your unique self interacting with others. Seems like that could be a basis for some real solidarity while these outgrown and outdated hierarchies go away. Thank you.